Before I get started, I'd like to address one thing very quickly. Today, we'll hear from witnesses who will share their perspectives on anti-Semitism. I'd ask those in the crowd to be respectful. Last Congress, protesters shouted profanities about Jewish people in our hate crimes hearing, so we shouldn't tolerate those sort of disruptions at today's hearing. With that, we're going to start with a short video of 1 minute and 6 seconds.
From coast to coast,
campus to campus,
Ivy Leagues, large universities, small colleges, and even high schools, pro-Palestinian protests are spreading and becoming increasingly disruptive.
Long live the Intifada. There is only one solution: Intifada revolution.
One protester was seen carrying a Hamas flag.
This movement is mushrooming.
We are Hamas!
You're Hamas, wow. That's a good one. You're what? You're Hamas?
Yes, we're all Hamas!
2023 anti-Semitic assault incidents increased by 45%, vandalism by 69%, and anti-Semitic harassment increased by 184%.
Jewish students I talked to, John, said quite simply they don't feel safe.
There's an acute problem taking place right now before our very eyes. I'll conclude by pointing out the obvious. Protecting Jewish people does not come at the expense of any other group.
This committee held a generalized hearing on hate crimes entitled "A Threat to Justice Everywhere, Stemming the Tide of Hate Crimes in America." You notice that our hearing title is similar. Our hearing title is "Never Be Silent, Stemming the Tide of Anti-Semitism in America." I want to explain why this isn't another generalized hearing on every kind of hate with no specific outcome. October the 27th, 2023 was a very horrifying days, the most in recent memory. Hamas terrorists waged the deadliest attack on Jews since the Holocaust. They callously murdered over 1,200 people, and they slaughtered children. Women were brutally raped. About 250 people, including Americans, were taken hostage. You'd expect this horror to lead everyone to rally around Jewish people. I had people stop me in the hallways last year and ask what I thought about all the killing that was going on as a result of this war. And I tried to respond in a very common sense way. Do you realize that nobody would be killed if Hamas had not invaded? Now, instead, we witnessed stunning acts of anti-Semitism on colleges' campuses. We saw prominent displays of Hezbollah flags, Hamas armbands, genocidal slogans. Our city streets, in them we heard chants of "Death to America" and quote unquote, "We are Hamas." Students, professors, rabbis, shopkeepers were harassed for no reason other than that they were Jewish. At Union Station, you saw on television anti-Israel antagonists brought their evil to the doorsteps of Capitol Hill. They burned American flags, vandalized government property with vile statements including, quote unquote, "Hamas is coming." Those burn marks remain there to this day. These atrocities were fundamentally un-American, and they raised disturbing questions such as who was funding these activities? What agenda do these people have? And why do colleges' campuses seem to be fertile ground for radical Islamic ideologue instead of campuses where there's peaceful discussion of opposing points of view and respect for each other's point of view? In the face of questions like these, Congress had a duty to shed light on this issue and to confront it with moral clarity. To that end, my colleagues in the House held multiple hearings on anti-Semitism, exposing the willful blindness of leaders in education and government. But on this side of the Capitol, committees remained silent. Presumably, this silence was because elements within the Democratic Party sympathized with protesters, as one Democratic senator put it, quote, "There is a reckoning necessary in the political left with anti-Semitism and how certain factions have responded after October the 7th. Continuing to quote that senator, "I don't hear a lot of people on our side really focused on condemning it." End of quote. In light of their deafening silences on May 2nd, 2024, every Republican on this committee wrote a letter requesting that we promptly hold a hearing of this committee to confront the flagrant civil rights violations targeting Jewish students. Yet even though anti-Semitism was literally happening right in front of our eyes, this committee didn't hold a hearing. But even then, after a few months, it was a vague hearing to, quote, "examine threats facing marginalized communities and how we can better protect the safety of all Americans," end of quote. During that hearing, we failed to give the issue of anti-Semitism the attention it deserved and the same attention it was getting on our college campuses. Republicans were given one witness, and incredibly tone-deaf statements were made during this hearing. For example, one of their witnesses called what we're seeing on college campuses, quote, "organic human rights movement," end of quote. She called it a complicated question when asked if Hezbollah and Hamas want to kill Jews, and she glossed over statements like, "long live the Intifada." Clearly, that hearing wasn't responsive to the May 2nd letter from Republicans. More importantly, it wasn't responsive to the historic levels of anti-Semitism that Jewish people were facing every day. In our Republican letter, we wrote, quote, "this committee owes it to Jewish students to examine these civil rights violations," end of quote. We're here today because we still do. The threat of anti-Semitism still looms large. Just last week, activists took over an academic building at Barnard College, injuring one employee so badly that they were hospitalized, and anti-Semitism has found expression beyond college campuses too, including through boycotts, employment discrimination, and even ESG policies. You'll find few people who are more in favor of the First Amendment than this senator, and I oppose censorship over political debate. But threats to the safety of Jewish people are obviously not protected forms of speech, yet that's what we're continuing to see and hear. Our former hearing quoted Dr. King's wise statement that injustices anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And of course, we all hate, be it on the basis of someone's religion, race, or anything else. But a hearing about everything is a hearing about nothing. When college campuses are assisting protesters in setting up Jewish exclusion zones, we miss the mark with a watered-down approach to anti-Semitism. When we equivocate about the acute threat to the Jewish community who were actively being assaulted, we end up turning a blind eye. During his acceptance speech for the Nobel Peace Prize, Elie Wiesel wrote, quote, "The world did know and remain silent, and that is why I swore never to be silent. We must always take sides. Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented," end of quote. We can't confront injustice without taking sides. We can't be neutral in the face of hatred. Anti-Semitism is and remains an ongoing poison. And unless we reckon with that, we'll never have the moral clarity to address other forms of injustice as they crop up. That's why, along with Wiesel, we must swear never to be silent, and that's why we're here today to expose and condemn the recent forms of anti-Semitism that went unaddressed in the last Senate, and to discuss the ongoing forms of anti-Semitism that we're seeing even within the last couple weeks, and to do it here in this Congress. Senator Durbin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for attending this important hearing. I never knew my grandmother. She was an immigrant to the United States in 1911. She brought 3 children with her. One was a 2-year-old, my mother. They took a ship. They started in Lithuania, where my mother was born, took a ship to Baltimore, not to New York and Ellis Island, and disembarked and somehow found their way to Illinois. I don't know how. I'm sure no one spoke English. She brought precious few things with her because she had 3 kids to worry about. But one of the things she made a point of bringing to the United States in 1911 was a Roman Catholic prayer book written in Lithuanian. I didn't know the significance of that prayer book. I'd seen it around the house, and my mom took care of it. But it turns out that the Russian Tsar had made it clear that this was contraband. This was illegal. You couldn't have a Catholic prayer book printed in Lithuanian. It had to be Russian. Somehow or another, my grandmother, with limited education, felt that that little book was so damned important that she was ready to risk it by bringing it to the United States of America. It was her statement and our family's statement about her freedom, the freedom of her family to practice their religion. They wanted to be here in the United States of America to practice that religion because they knew that this was a different country than the one they were leaving. Many of the nation's founders fled religious persecution, so religious freedom was critical to them as it was to my grandmother. I still have that prayer book, incidentally, up in my office. That's why the freedom of religion, often called the Constitution's first freedom, is enshrined as the First Amendment to our Constitution. But throughout our history, the United States has grappled with anti-Semitism, which historians have called the, quote, oldest hatred. One infamous example is the 1915 Atlanta lynching of Leo Frank, a prominent Jewish American businessman. Frank's kidnapping and lynching spurred the revival of the Ku Klux Klan, who were notorious for their anti-Jewish bigotry and violence. Most recently, we've seen a resurgence, a sad, tragic resurgence of anti-Semitism in America since the horrific Hamas attack on Israel on October 7th, 2023. And now I'd like to say a few words about the hearing that we had on hate speech as it impacted all religions: Jewish religion, Muslim religion, Christian religion. Yes, we had a hearing on hate speech. We didn't focus on one aspect of it. We focused on many aspects of it. One of the witnesses, or at least attending, I shouldn't say witness, but attending, was the mother of a 6-year-old boy, a Palestinian boy from the suburbs of Chicago. His name was Wadi Al-Fayumi. The landlord in the house where the Palestinian family was living came to the door and told them to leave. And when they didn't leave, he pulled out a knife and stabbed the 6-year-old boy to death repeatedly, over and over and over again. His mother was hiding in the bathroom. She'd been stabbed as well. It was clearly a hate crime, and it was based on their religion. And the fact that that was part of the hearing did not diminish in any way my strong feelings about anti-Semitism. It is the same hatred that we are trying to stamp out in this country. In 2023 alone, which only includes the first 3 months after October 7th, the FBI reported 2,000 hate crimes against the Jewish community. More than 2/3 of all reported religious-based hate crimes in 2023 were driven by anti-Jewish bias. I'm making no excuses for that, but whether your bias is against the Jewish people, Muslim people, Christian people, or any other religion, it is still a hate crime, and in America we should condemn them all. As chair of this committee, I held multiple hearings on the growing threat of hate-motivated violence. We heard compelling testimony from Rabbi Charlie Citron Walker. I hope I pronounced that name correctly, did I? About the 2022 hostage crisis at his Colleyville, Texas synagogue. He told us how he opened the door to the terrorists because of his belief, the rabbi said, that the temple should be, quote, a house of prayer for all people. He also testified he survived that day because, as the leader of a synagogue in America, he was well trained to respond to security threats. We have to work together to bring about a day where rabbis need only be spiritual leaders, not security experts as well. Rabbi Citron Walker told us that, quote, a terrorist chose a Jewish synagogue because he thought the Jews control the world, end of quote. We must do everything in our power to debunk this bigoted lie, which has driven so much anti-Semitism throughout history. Let's be clear, there is no justification, none, for anti-Semitism, whether from the left or the right side of the political spectrum. Violence or threats of violence have no place, none, on our college campuses and should be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. It is up to the political leaders to stand up and condemn anti-Semitism wherever and whenever we see it, even if it's coming from the most powerful people in the nation. That's why I feel compelled to say how troubled I am by some of the actions of this administration. First of all, I reject President Trump's comments that, quote, any Jewish person that votes for Democrats hates their religion. That was a statement by President Trump. And, quote, people in this country that are Jewish no longer love Israel. That's what the president said. What does that mean? On his first day in office, President Trump issued a full, unconditional pardon to the thugs responsible for the January 6th insurrection. Many of the rioters who received pardons openly embrace violent anti-Semitism. Take Robert Keith Walker, who wore a black hoodie emblazoned with the quote, the shameful quote, Camp Auschwitz on that horrific day. Or consider Timothy Hale Cusinelli, who prosecutors identified as, quote, a white supremacist and Nazi sympathizer. A white supremacist and Nazi sympathizer. He told his co-workers that, quote, Hitler should have finished the job. Those are the words of Timothy Hale Cusinelli. He frankly often dresses up to look like Adolf Hitler, and here's a photograph. At Hale Cusinelli's hearing, Judge Trevor McFadden, a Trump appointee as judge, said, quote, statements and actions like yours, he said to Cusinelli, make Jewish people less safe and less confident they can participate as equal members of our society. After his release from prison, Mr. Hale Cusinelli was welcomed as a speaker at 2 events held by president supporters at his Bedminster Club. At one of these events, he received an award from Ed Martin. Name sound familiar? Now serving as President Trump's interim U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia. Mr. Martin called Hale Cusinelli, and I quote, an extraordinary man, an extraordinary leader. This president has also given an outside role in his administration to Elon Musk. Mr. Musk has endorsed and followed some of the most far-right German political parties. He even suggested that, quote, there's, quote, from Elon Musk, frankly, too much of a focus on past guilt, and we need to move beyond that, he said. In response, Dani Dayan, the chair of Yad Vashem, the world's Holocaust Remembrance Center in Israel, said, and I quote, contrary to Musk's advice, the remembrance and acknowledge of the dark past of the country and its people should be central in shaping the German society. Failing to do so is an insult to the victims of Nazism and a clear danger to the democratic future of Germany. The Trump administration has also launched a broad attack on diversity, equity, and inclusion policies, which has already led one federal agency to suspend Holocaust Remembrance Day observance. If the Trump administration is truly committed to combating anti-Semitism on college campuses, they would not be talking about eliminating the Education Department's Office of Civil Rights, which is responsible for enforcing anti-discrimination laws in schools. In fact, the administration has already laid off a dozen officials from the Office for Civil Rights and ordered remaining staff to halt most of their work. I am deeply concerned that President Trump and his allies have promoted the so-called Great Replacement Theory. This theory was cited by the gunman who killed 11 worshipers at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, the most deadly assault on the Jewish American community in our nation's history. He claimed that Jewish Americans are conspiring to destroy the white race by encouraging non-white immigrants to invade our country. In closing, I'd like to quote from a statement I received for this hearing from over 100 national and local Jewish organizations, including Reform, Conservative, and Reconstructionist movements, warning that, quote, history has made clear that our safety as Jews is inextricably linked with inclusive, pluralistic democracy and with the rights and safety of all people. When the rule of law and democratic norms are threatened, anti-Semitism invariably increases, and Jews and all communities are made less safe. That was a message from 100 national and local Jewish organizations about this hearing. I hope this committee can come together, across the aisle, to protect our democracy and protect the safety and security of the Jewish community.
Before I introduce the witnesses, I think I want to make clear that I think that the Trump administration is taking strong steps to fight anti-Semitism in this country. Yesterday, for instance, Trump threatened to pull federal funding from any colleges, schools, and universities that allow illegal protests. He issued 2 executive orders, one in this term and one in last term. And his Attorney General, Pan Bondi, created a multi-agency task force to help tackle this problem. And I think we should also support the Department of Education's recently announced Title VI investigation into universities where anti-Semitic harassment has been responded. I'm going to introduce 3 witnesses, and Senator Durbin's going to introduce 2. Our first witness is Ms. Adela Kohab. She's a legal fellow at the National Jewish Advocacy Center, New York City, an advocate for Jewish college students. She gained national attention while a student at NYU when she filed a civil rights complaint against the university in 2019 for discrimination against Jewish students. She's also a UN speaker on Jewish rights and has written extensively on issues related to anti-Semitism in Israel. You're welcome. Next, we have Eliza Lewin, president of the Louis D. Brandeis Center for Human Rights Under Law. This nonprofit was created to advance civil and human rights for Jewish people and promote justice for all. The Brandeis Center engages in research, education, legal advocacy, combating the resurgence of anti-Semitism on campuses and in workplaces. The center also trains students to understand their legal rights and educate employers on best practices to combat anti-Semitism. Then we'll hear from Uzra Noami, an American journalist, author, activist, who has worked on issues related to Islam's women's rights and free speech. She's a former Wall Street Journal reporter. She has written extensively on these issues. Her advocacy is motivated by her dear friend and colleague, Daniel Pearl, who we all know was savagely murdered by terrorists in Pakistan. Senator Durbin.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to first welcome Kevin Racklin. He's the inaugural Washington director at the Nexus Project. 15 years experience in advocacy, coalition building, and nonprofit leadership. Senior fellow for Israel and Palestine policy at the Alliance for Peace Building. Kevin previously served as Vice President of Public Affairs at J Street and as the U.S. Director for the Alliance for Middle East Peace. I also welcome Mirav Solomon. Did I pronounce your name correctly? Good. Junior at Tufts University, studying international relations, concentrating on the Middle East. She's an alumnus of the School for Ethics and Global Leadership. I'm going to mess this name up, I'm afraid. The Kavunan Gap Year Program and Seeds of Peace. She's also served on Tufts Hillel Student Board and is trained dialogue facilitator with Essential Partners. Thank you all for being here.
Now I would ask you to stand and take an oath. Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give before this committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? So help you God. Let the record note that all have said yes, and we'll let you start, Adela. Please start.
Thank you. Chairman Grassley, Ranking Member Durbin, members of the committee, good morning. My name is Adela Kochav, and I'm a legal fellow at the National Jewish Advocacy Center. My family's originally from Syria and Lebanon, and then they moved to Mexico City, where I was born, before we made our way to the United States. I grew up in a small Syrian Jewish community in Deal, New Jersey, where Zionism was always an integral part of my Jewish identity, like the overwhelming majority of the Jewish community in the United States. I started college in 2015 at what I thought was my dream school, NYU, and my first 2 years were great. But my junior year, everything shifted to Israel and Palestine. From boycotts in student government to boycotts against Israeli academics to 53 student groups pledging to boycott not only Israel, but the group that I was president of, and any group that would dare to partner with us. I, along with the Jewish community, felt entirely isolated. I met with 8 administrators across 5 departments who told me I was perceiving imagined threats. At one of our events, an anti-Zionist student set an Israeli flag on fire, while another grabbed the microphone from a Jewish girl chanting "Free Palestine." Protesters tore down our flags, shredding them and hanging them from trees and lampposts. NYPD made arrests for property theft and damage, reckless endangerment, and assault. All of this occurred in the presence of NYU staff, security, and administrators, but the school didn't even make a statement. That same week, I was mobbed by a group of anti-Israel students yelling slurs in my face with their phones in my face. And at one point, the president of student government, herself overtly anti-Zionist, felt the need to step in before things got too violent. She broke through her own friend group, pushed through the crowd, and urged me to run. I left student government and stepped down from all of my leadership positions. My professors told me to stop attending classes in the Middle Eastern Studies departments, and they arranged for me to take my final exams in a separate room away from my peers. Instead of taking action, NYU gave SJP an award for their outstanding contributions to NYU life. I tried to meet with the school, but again, my calls were dodged. At that point, I made the difficult decision to file a complaint against NYU for failing to protect the Jewish community. And remember, all of this was years before October 7th, 2023. In December of 2019, my case caught the attention of President Trump. He invited me to speak with him at a conference, and 3 days later, he signed the executive order on combating anti-Semitism. After that, I thought that things would get better. I made the decision to go to law school inspired by my experiences, but I chose to go to Yeshiva University, away from the hostility that I faced at NYU. I worked at the Queens DA and the Brooklyn DA, and I was ready to start my career as a prosecutor. Unfortunately, then came the events of October 7th, with Hamas's brutal attack in Israel and the aftermath that we saw here in America. Campuses across the country exploded with anti-Semitism, and I started getting calls from students asking me if they should hide their Magen Davids and take off their kippot. I was shocked and dumbfounded. I thought back to my time at NYU, and instead of becoming an ADA, I made the decision to work for the National Jewish Advocacy Center to defend Jewish civil rights. And senators, I'm here to testify that there's been no shortage of work. Yes, we focus on college campuses because that's where this kind of hatred is most apparent, but it's not necessarily where it's most acute. For example, studies show that campus-based anti-Semitism serves as a predictor for anti-Semitic incidents in surrounding counties. What I saw at NYU almost 6 years ago did not stay on campus. It has since spilled into workplaces, boardrooms, and city streets. At NJAC, we see Title VI cases on campuses, of course, but also in K-12 schools. We see Title VII in employment discrimination, Title II in public accommodations. We fight major corporations who are integrating BDS into their ESG policies. And we have dozens of cases for anti-Semitic incidents on airlines. At NJAC, we've also, after October 7th, have filed 5 major federal anti-terror cases against those providing material support to Hamas. We even used FaceBack Act provisions about obstructing houses of worship in order to protect synagogues from anti-Israel protests. The last administration had little appetite to enforce federal civil rights law that was already in place. So we had to take new ways, to pioneer ways to protect our community. I'm thrilled to see that the new administration is finally taking the issue seriously, but I'm also incredibly disheartened to see that some people still politicize this. First, at anti-Semitism hearings, we'll often hear from voices that don't represent the overwhelming majority of the Jewish community. Second, it seems that before this hearing, National Students for Justice in Palestine, which is one of the defendants in our anti-terror cases, sent out an email about this hearing looking for stories of the chilling effect that Trump's administration and their executive orders that he signed, especially after my case, might have on those tormenting the Jewish community. Now, we should give the committee the benefit of the doubt. SJP has never been known for their integrity. But even if the email's not true, it means that SJP saw an opening because of how political this has become. They're trying to attach themselves to the Democratic Party in order to co-opt their efforts to have a meaningful, real conversation about anti-Semitism. And I implore the members of this committee not to let that happen. I urge the minority to see us as people, your own constituents who actually need protection. We are the targets of hate crimes and discrimination. We want to work with you. Help us instead of looking for counterfactual counter-narratives. Next, I know some, like SJP, might frame steps to fight anti-Semitism as a threat against freedom of speech. Read the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act or the executive order, and they have nothing to do with speech. Anyone can say anything, no matter how abhorrent, about Jews or the Jewish state, but they cannot use that hate to justify unlawful discrimination. In terms of concrete proposals, we must adopt the IRA definition, which is supported by virtually every major Jewish organization, as well as the Bush, Obama, and Biden administrations across all federal discrimination law. Without a clear standard, justice is arbitrary, and anti-Semitism thrives in loopholes. Congress has the power and the obligation to close them. That, at the very least, should be bipartisan. Thank you, and I welcome any questions.
Thank you very much. Now, Mr. Rashan.
Thank you so much, Chairman Grassley, Ranking Member Durbin, and members of the committee. My name is Kevin Racklin, and I am the Washington Director of the Nexus Project, a group committed to countering the dangerous spike in anti-Semitism in ways that bring communities together and that preserve academic freedom and the right to free expression. Anti-Semitism in America has reached alarming new levels. The latest FBI data shows that Jewish Americans, which account for about 2% of our population, were targeted in nearly 60% of all religious hate crimes, a nearly 20% jump from the previous year. This demands our serious attention and urgent action. Today, we will hear from Ms. Solomon, and we have just heard from Ms. Coab about the human toll that anti-Semitism can take on students on campus. Harassment, protest chants targeting Jewish students because of their identity, Jewish students being excluded from organizations unless they renounce their Zionist identity, synagogues, JCCs, and preschools requiring armed guards. We even hear of Holocaust survivors who, for the second time in their life, feel the need to hide who they are. Whether it's the fallout from October 7th, or the growth of Nazi expressions online, Jews around the world have a heightened understanding of how much inherited fear and trauma that we carry with us as a result of the Holocaust. So the normalizing of Nazi symbols, ideas, and slogans, like the Nazi salute, is deeply shocking and upsetting. Seeing this salute, one of the most perversive signals of anti-Semitism on perhaps the most prestigious platform in the country, is beyond terrifying for American Jews and Jews all around the world. Who could have imagined a president hosting a known Holocaust denier like Nick Fuentes, or a rap star who promotes brazen anti-Semitism? Who could have imagined senior administration officials promoting the Great Replacement Theory rhetoric, the same ideology that drove mass shootings at Tree of Life, El Paso, and Poway? What more troubling signal can there be for the American Jewish community? And what's most troubling about all of this is that the lack of meaningful condemnation when public figures like Steve Bannon and Elon Musk advance anti-Semitic conspiracy theories or flash Nazi salutes at major political gatherings. These gestures are celebrated and embraced by the most extreme parts of the hate movement, and the relative silence of too many of our politicians normalizes hate and emboldens those animated by anti-Semitic ideas. Congress has spent more time in press conferences and hearings than voting on funding for substantial solutions to this crisis. The Trump administration, meanwhile, seems to be using the legitimate pain of Jewish communities to advance an agenda that most Jewish Americans do not support. A prime example of this is the Heritage Foundation's Project Esther. This initiative is not endorsed by any major Jewish organization and was developed with minimal Jewish input. And it shows. Esther harmfully exploits our legitimate security concerns to sow fear and whip up support for policies that Jewish Americans have not asked for and overwhelmingly reject. Project Esther paints liberal civil society groups as a Hamas support network without any proof. A recent Trump administration executive order seeks to turn universities into immigration enforcers. These actions divide communities and waste critical resources that could be used more practically to tackle actual anti-Semitism in this country. The demonizing of vital institutions in Esther is now starting to come out in the mouths of our cabinet secretaries, like Secretary Kennedy, who just this week called universities greenhouses for this deadly pestilence of so-called woke cancel culture. This does not make Jews feel safer. It divides our society and pits Jews against other vulnerable communities who also face xenophobia, hate, and discrimination. Jewish safety is most secure in healthy and thriving democracies with robust civil rights protections. History shows that we are most vulnerable when democratic institutions are weakened or destroyed. Therefore, I really wish this committee to consider these recommendations. First, I urge you to speak out against anti-Semitism, regardless if it comes from your party or your group. This should be easy. No respectable person should stand by in silence while public figures use the symbols, slogans, and ideas of the most anti-Semitic, hateful, and genocidal regime in human history. Second, instead of hearings and finger-pointing, use your power to authorize concrete action, like the Countering Anti-Semitism Act, which was introduced last year and which the majority of this committee supported and co-sponsored. While that bill is flawed, it still enjoyed far more Jewish communal support than any other congressional initiative related to this issue in recent memory. Third, listen to us. Listen to Jewish voices. Listen to the large plurality of Jewish voices and organizations warning that America must not be allowed to slide into authoritarianism. Now, as throughout our history, attacks on pluralism and on democratic norms make us feel less safe. And finally, don't discard the 2023 National Strategy to Counter Anti-Semitism. It is a landmark document, a first of its kind, developed with input from over 1,000 Jewish communal professionals and with robust bipartisan support, including most of the people on this committee. We need thoughtful, evidence-based policies rather than rhetorical gestures that exploit our fears for unrelated political objectives. The most important way to confront anti-Semitism is to strengthen democracy and not to undermine it. There has to be a way for leaders can protect Jews without targeting other communities. I know that I and the other members of the other witnesses stand ready to work with this committee on real solutions that bring communities together rather than divide them apart. Thank you so much, and I look forward to everyone's questions.
Thank you. Now, Ms. Lewin.
Chairman Grassley, Ranking Member Durbin, and esteemed members of the committee, I'm honored to appear before you today. My name is Aliza Lewin, and I'm president of the Louis D. Brandeis Center for Human Rights Under Law. I also have a law practice together with my father, Nathan Lewin, where I worked full-time before coming to the Brandeis Center. As an attorney, I've devoted much of my professional career to pursuing legal initiatives on behalf of the Jewish people. I led the legal team that represented the Israeli manufacturer and distributor of Ben & Jerry's ice cream in his lawsuit against the ice cream company, which prevented an unlawful boycott of Israel. And I argued the case Zivotofsky versus Kerry before the U.S. Supreme Court, which influenced U.S. policy on Jerusalem's recognition. And together with my father, we brought the first first case in the U.S. under the Anti-Terrorism Act, which helped establish a legal precedent enabling American victims of terror to sue domestic-based groups that provide material support for terror. As president of the Brandeis Center, I have spoken for the past 7 years when I've been in this position, almost every day, with students, parents, employees, medical professionals, patients, and other individuals who have encountered anti-Semitism. And let me share with you a bit of what I am hearing from them. First, Jewish students on campus are being subjected to a sustained, coordinated campaign that has convinced many of their classmates, professors, and even some administrators that it's okay and even commendable to ostracize Jewish students who refuse to renounce their connection to Israel. Two, universities have not only failed to protect their Jewish students from this harassment, but over the past year they have frequently catered to the very people who are doing the discrimination by refusing to hold them accountable for violating university policies and the law. Three, often the ones engaging in the discrimination claim that they're not discriminating against Jews, they're only discriminating against quote-unquote Zionists. But Zionism, the recognition that the Jews are a people with a deep ancestral connection to the land of Israel, and that as a people, Jews have a right to self-determination in their ancestral homeland, is, for most Jews, an integral component of their Jewishness. It's true that not all Jews are Zionists, just as not all Jews are Sabbath observers. But that does not negate the fact that for Jews who observe the Sabbath and for Jews who celebrate the Jewish people's ancestral heritage, those are key components of what it means to them to be Jewish. If someone were to exclude all Sabbath-observant Jews from their club, that would be obvious Jew hatred. Excluding Jews from a club or a space on campus for being Zionists is no different. It's akin to demanding that a Catholic disavow the Vatican or Muslims distance themselves from Mecca in order to be accepted. It's discriminatory, biased, and immoral. Four, over and over again, students and faculty and outside agitators break laws and violate campus rules in order to single out Israel and demonize the Jewish people. Make no mistake, what we're seeing on campus is not a good faith political debate. Students are not dialoguing, they're not even debating Middle Eastern policy in an effort to make constructive change. No, in fact, when Jewish students seek to engage and actually discuss the issues, they're frequently shut down and told, we don't speak to Zionists, or we won't speak with the colonizing oppressors. What's taking place on campus is not a good faith political debate. It is the vilification of Jews. Some have referred to it as the placard strategy. The messaging boils down to this simple equation of the Star of David equals the Zionists equals some evil concept. You can have your choice: apartheid, ethnic cleansing, colonialism, genocide, right? Those concepts are not being offered for a discussion about whether or not we meet the legal definition of apartheid or ethnic cleansing or genocide. No, they are being offered just to hammer into people's head the equation that needs to equate the Jew with evil. After October 7th, we began to see new placards on the campuses that said, let's keep our campus clean, with the Star of David in the trash can. So now the move has begun to push the Jews out of acceptable society. Number 5, this Jew hatred is now spreading beyond the campuses. We're seeing it spread to workplaces, the healthcare industry, the publishing industry, and more. And 6, the IRA definition, the most universally accepted definition there is desperately needed now to help educate administrators and society on how to tell the difference between a good faith political debate and the vilification of Jews. We should be engaging in the former and avoiding the latter. The IHRA definition states explicitly that, quote, criticism of Israel similar to that leveled against any other country cannot be considered anti-Semitic. It's not anti-Semitic to criticize Israel. It is anti-Semitic to demonize, delegitimize, or apply a double standard to Jews and the Jewish collective, the Jewish nation state. And we need to begin using the IRA definition to understand the difference between the two. 7, it's become clear to me that without congressional oversight, schools and workplaces are not going to fix this problem on their own. The law is a powerful motivating tool, and we need to begin using it to give administrators the backbone to hold accountable those who are engaging in this Jew hatred. I thank you again for including me in this hearing, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Lewin. Now, Ms. Solomon.
Chairman Grassley, Ranking Member Durbin, and members of this committee, I'm grateful for the privilege to testify before this committee and for your attention to the issue of campus anti-Semitism. My name is Meirav Batsheva Solomon. I grew up in Raleigh, North Carolina, and I'm a junior at Tufts University studying international relations. I'm a proud Jewish American and the daughter of 2 conservative rabbis. I'm grateful for the tradition I grew up in, the values and ethics it instilled in me, and for the Jewish community I have found at Tufts. I'm here to share how I and other Jewish students experienced the increase in anti-Semitic incidents. Since October 7th, we've seen some rhetoric at anti-war protests cross the line into ugly stereotyping, hateful vitriol on social media, and violent threats against Jewish students. For me, for my friends, for my community, the issue of anti-Semitism is heartbreakingly personal and real. Too many protesters have embraced anti-Semitic tropes or conflated the government of Israel with Jewish people around the world. But we cannot give up on the colleges and universities we call home. We have no common cause with those who want to discredit or defund higher education. Protecting education, civil rights, and open dialogue is vital to my future and to the ability of Jewish students to succeed and thrive. The vast majority of our classmates are not Hamas-aligned radicals. They're students whose perspectives may differ from ours, but must be welcome as long as they voice them respectfully. When my grandparents applied to college, anti-Semitic quotas kept them from getting a fair shake. We shouldn't let the hateful ideas of a small minority of students be a reason to dismantle the education they fought so hard for. Anti-Semites ascribe many sins to Jews. They charge us with deicide and propagate myths of blood libel. They blame us for capitalist excess or for communist plots, for rootless globalism or dual loyalty. But Congress and the Trump administration are abandoning the most effective tools the government has to fight anti-Semitism in all of its forms. The Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights handles cases of discrimination and harassment against Jewish students, providing a crucial avenue for Jews and other minorities to advocate for our rights. This administration has suspended thousands of OCR investigations and no longer allows students or their families to file complaints. And now the office's future is uncertain. By threatening to withhold federal funds from universities that do not scrap their DEI programs, this administration is threatening the future of Holocaust awareness and anti-Semitism education on campus. This administration seems determined to sacrifice resources that keep Jewish students like me safe at the altar of their culture war. This president is taking a cue from the Heritage Foundation's Project Esther, developed by a task force that includes Christian nationalists without any major Jewish organization's input. Project Esther blames the spread of anti-Semitism on us. It completely ignores any anti-Semitism on the right, where year after year, the vast majority of violent incidents occur. As the president's close advisors raise their arms in fascist salutes, bigots on social media glorify Nazis and denigrate Jews, and white nationalist groups stage xenophobic rallies, we must be honest about the most urgent threat to the Jewish community. It is not student protesters, but the bloody legacy of Pittsburgh and Poway, Charlottesville, and the Capitol riot. I cannot blame Jewish students who, amid growing right-wing terror, see this fixation on campuses as more about someone else's political agenda than our safety. True support for Jewish students like me means listening to our diverse experiences and needs and not using us to advance partisan agendas. Our parents and grandparents fought for the right to a quality education for Jews and for all Americans. The actions of this administration are divisive, and they erode the civil rights and basic freedoms that have allowed American Jews to flourish. Our right to a thriving, equal future depends on your commitment to protect the values of pluralism and democracy in which Jews and all Americans can thrive. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Now, Mrs. Noamer.
Thank you so much, Chairman Grassley and Ranking Member Durbin. I sit before you today as a witness to what I have seen on the streets of our world. I was born in India. My parents gave me the name of Asra Nomani. Asra means the mystical journey that the Prophet Muhammad made from Mecca to Jerusalem, landing at the rock that now is called the Dome of the Rock. Why I'm here today is because I have a deep and profound care for every sentiment expressed today about this war that we are seeing on the Jewish people. It is disturbing and frightening. It is my worst nightmare. 22 years ago, I stood on a street in Karachi, Pakistan, and I waved goodbye to a dear friend. His name was Daniel Pearl. He was a friend who helped me learn America as an immigrant. He went with me to the big hunt down at DuPont Circle, now abandoned. He let me throw my first party because I hadn't gone to my prom as a good Muslim girl. There were parrots above us, and they sang into that Karachi sun. And in the days that followed, my friends, we learned that Danny had been kidnapped. He had been kidnapped by Muslim militants. First, they said he was a spy for the CIA. And then the newspapers unfortunately reported that Danny is Jewish. The ransom note arrived, senators, and it said that he was not just a spy for America, but he was a spy for the Mossad, the Israeli intelligence agency. What they did in those next days is they demonized Danny because he was a grandson of Israel. Weeks later, we received the murder video. And in the murder video, Danny declared those words that are lasting forever beyond his breath. My father is Jewish, my mother is Jewish, I am Jewish. Many people will think that he was targeted because he was Jewish. But an FBI agent went and interviewed the kidnapper, and he said, I didn't target him just because he's Jewish. I targeted him because he is a son of Israel. And in those last words of Danny, he said, there is a street in a town called B'nai Brak with my ancestor's name, Haim Pearl Street. I am here to report to you that in the 22 years since then, I have been investigating the network that has perpetuated the hate that was targeted against Danny. We have called them agitators today, and we have called them protesters, but they have names. They are from organizations that are in a network that I have numbered now at 1,500. This is not a grassroots organization. They put out posters like this one with military warfare, and ironically, no pride in genocide, free Palestine. They target everyone. I have this poster from the Democratic National Committee convention, and you will see familiar faces, yes, because they target the Democrats also. But if you don't believe me about this network, look at their signs. What does it say here? American Muslims for Palestine. What does, Chairman Grassley, you mentioned the Hamas is coming graffiti at Union Station. It was not just an agitator, it was a man who is the Richmond director of American Muslims for Palestine. Who is it that burnt the flag at Union Station? It was a man who is, look at the fine print, Party for Socialism and Liberation. The hate that killed Danny Pearl on the streets of Karachi is now in our streets. It's on our campuses. It's a frightening network of the far left and the Islamist groups. Nobody in this room can support their ideals. Their ideals are against individual liberties and free enterprise. They want to destroy the United States of America. They want to destroy Israel. And our young Jewish students on campuses, our younger Dannies, are in their crosshairs. We must recognize this existential threat. It is a vast network. We must investigate them. We must have them register with the Foreign Agent Registration Act when they are doing the work of these malign foreign actors that want to destroy America. And we must support Muslim reform movement leaders who want to stand up with our Jewish brothers and sisters. Two of them sit behind me today, Anila Ali and Surya Deen, and they are the solution. We are the solution. We do not have to be divided in our contest over suffering. We must end hate of all kinds so that Danny's legacy can survive into the modern day with freedom for all, and transparency and accountability so that all our young Dannies can be safe in this world. Thank you so much.
Before we start our 5-minute round of questioning, because there's a vote on, and I'll be gone for a short period of time to vote. If there's a Republican president, please take over, but if there's no Republican here, I hope the Democrats will take turns asking their questions. I'm going to start with you, Ms. Nalami. At our last hearing, a member of the other side said, quote, "What we are trying to do is to identify a problem in America that extends beyond the Jewish population," end quote. As a Muslim woman, I'm sure hate crimes against all religious minorities trouble you, and you've said that very clearly just now. But in our current environment, do you think that anti-Semitism warrants attention in its own right?
Sir, it absolutely does warrant attention in its own right. Anti-Semitism is now an industry. It is an industry that is being perpetuated, unfortunately, by organizations that even have nonprofit status in America, 501c3s, 501c4s. And these are organizations that are belying their own mission in order to use as a Trojan horse this opposition to Israel to perpetuate this hate. These young students that we have are the targets of that hate. It is October 7th became their moment. And what has happened is that, unfortunately, pulling our punches and not recognizing their danger in our society serves no one, and it absolutely does not serve our interests of an inclusive society. An actual inclusive society means that we do not allow hate of any kind, and the kind that we have right now against our Jewish community is of epidemic proportions.
Ms. Kohab, this first question, if you don't want to answer it, you don't have to. I got 2 questions for you. What are your views on Trump's administration approach to anti-Semitism, and what is the most thoughtful and effective way that you think the task force can address the issue?
Thank you for the question. First, I want to say this is about anti-Semitism, but I do believe that President Trump has been the greatest ally that Israel has had in the White House and that the Jewish people have had. When I was a student and I filed my complaint against NYU after feeling I was consistently ignored, Trump's administration invited me to speak with him, and he signed an executive order on combating anti-Semitism, and that speaks volume. And it really, really pains me to see that after what we saw on October 7th, when every single campus erupted in anti-Semitism, the students that were on campus across all universities didn't have the same treatment. They did not feel heard by the administration. They didn't see an executive order making sure that their rights are protected and heard. And actually, during last administration after October 7th, not a single university has lost its federal funding under Title VI, despite how many Title VI cases have been filed against them. So I have to say that I very much welcome Trump's actions in combating anti-Semitism. Now, your second question, can you remind me?
What is your most thoughtful and effective way that you think the task force can address the issue?
Absolutely. I think that the first thing that the task force has to do is adopt a definition. And the IHRA definition has been adopted by the overwhelming majority of Jewish organizations. Actually, of the Conference of Presidents of the major Jewish organizations, 51 of 53 have adopted the IHRA definition. 38 states have adopted the IHRA definition. The United States government has adopted IHRA for Title VI, and also they've adopted it in the State Department in 2015. In order to have a definition, you must have objectivity, and this is a definition that, number one, understands anti-Semitism the best. Its examples show how anti-Semitism shifts and shakes and changes with the times depending on what people want to scapegoat. And there is also the requirement of objectivity. In order to have a good working definition, it must be objectively be able to be recognized in order to be used. And IHRA is that objective definition. I think that until we pass a bipartisan act that defines anti-Semitism, we cannot fight it, because it's impossible to fight something that you can't define.
And then also for you, bin Laden's letter to America, this surfaced in November 2023, surged in popularity on social media, as an influencer, what role do you think social media plays in spreading anti-Semitism, and how are the platforms responsible for it?
So that's a phenomenal question. And first, I want to say that social media doesn't generate ideas, it just spreads them. And this is actually what I was taught at NYU. In one of my Middle Eastern Studies classes, we read an essay called The Jihadist Next Door, among many other essays that glorified religious extremism and jihadism, putting it in the social and cultural context of the time. And when I raised my hand in class to ask whether Osama bin Laden was a terrorist, I was met with scoffs and laughs, and my professor said, I'm sure some would call him that. So I saw this at NYU in 2016 and 17. This was nothing new. So in 2023, when this starts going viral on social media, all I saw was exactly what my peers were already parroting. Now, as someone who does have a substantial following on social media, I mainly use Instagram. I also use YouTube. I no longer use TikTok. The algorithms across all platforms have been ripe for anti-Semitism, not only because of the sheer numbers, because of the way that clickbait works. A video that I would post on Instagram would go viral on TikTok in a completely opposite direction, to the point that I was getting death threats, calls for me to commit suicide on the daily, and I'm no longer on TikTok. Now, when it comes to anti-Semitism across all social media platforms, they've done way too little. Their bias reporting is completely non-transparent. I've had posts taken down where I was just reporting on anti-Semitism, while other people who are holding up Nazi symbols or who are openly calling for the genocide of all Jews had their posts continue to stay up. And I think that until we look at the way that social media is perpetuating these dangerous ideas, which do exist and have existed, we're going to have a very big problem. And I do have two younger sisters, both of them Gen Z, very different politically. And if you look at what each has on their algorithm, they're looking to divide and distract.
Senator Durbin.
I'm trying to resolve in my mind the notion that we are all committed to stopping anti-Semitism, while at the same time the funding of certain agencies which have that responsibility is being cut dramatically. The Office of Civil Rights in the U.S. Department of Education is reportedly, under the new administration, no longer opening cases based on complaints from students like Ms. Solomon and families of anti-Semitism on campus. Instead, they're focusing on so-called directed investigations ordered by the new administration. Employees have said that they've been told not to communicate with students, families, and schools involved in cases launched by the previous administration, with the exception of disability-related claims, and to cancel scheduled meetings and mediations. The funding of this Office of Civil Rights is critical, and it's not been adequately funded for a long time, despite opening a number of Title VI investigations about anti-Semitism since the October 7th, 2023 terrorist attack in Israel. So it comes down to this. If we're going to close down diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is not only proactive but also reactive to discrimination, if we are going to underfund the Office of Civil Rights, we can have these hearings every week. In fact, we can have them twice a week. And the obvious question is, who's going to litigate the claims that are made of anti-Semitism on campus or anywhere else? If you truly want to stop anti-Semitism, you at least have to leave open the possibility that there will be some way to litigate your case. Ms. Solomon, have you seen this experience?
Yes, I have seen this experience across campus. The fear for Jewish students to now report and be able to access avenues of advocacy, to be able to advocate for themselves on college campuses, whether they face anti-Semitism on the right or the left, has been severely harmed by this current administration.
Mr. Rockland?
I couldn't agree with Ms. Solomon more. The data shows, as of last year, before the new administration had decided to stop funding and starting to investigate whether or not the Department of Education should exist, there was a 50-to-1 caseload in terms of 50 cases per one investigator at OCR. The office has consistently been underfunded and is consistently up for cuts by Congress. One of the things that I have been talking about and pushing more than anything else is this was a bill last Congress called the Showing Up for Students Act that was introduced by your colleague, Mr. Casey, and Mr. Goldman on the House side. And all this would do would be to increase the amount of money to go to OCR so that they can adequately have the funding to continue these investigations. I think without OCR in this space, things get very dangerous. And while it's languishing in purgatory, more and more cases continue to build up.
So the point of this inquiry is basic. If we all agree on the premise that anti-Semitism should be stopped, where do you go to stop it? If the new administration believes it shouldn't be the Department of Education, even some have called for abolishing that department, and it shouldn't be the Office of Civil Rights, where do you turn? You can't have it both ways. You can't declare that this is wrong and we need to stop it, we need to give due process and a day in court to those who are aggrieved, and then shut down on your funding and your philosophy the venues that are important for this to happen. That to me just seems so obvious. I can't follow the thinking on that. So I hope that we can resolve that. Let me yield at this point because I have to go vote to Senator Lee.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks to each of you for being here. This is an important topic and one that we've got to wrestle with. You know, over the last year and a half, far too many of our once respected academic institutions in America have become hotspots. Not just places that tolerate it, but hotspots of anti-Semitic rhetoric, violence, and hostility. The inaction of both university presidents and university administrators, along with inaction on the part of the Biden administration. These are things that have allowed a notable and unfortunate surge in anti-Semitism to create an atmosphere of fear and intimidation. Depriving Jewish students, among others, of the opportunity to have a safe learning environment, an environment that's conducive to learning as opposed to something quite the opposite of that. Now, in contrast, just over the few weeks he's been in office, President Trump has already issued an executive order to combat anti-Semitism on the campuses of America's colleges and universities. To enforce that mandate, he's established the Federal Task Force to Combat Anti-Semitism, which plans to visit 10 universities identified as having allowed anti-Semitic violence to foment and to remain unchecked. Now, moments ago, we heard from one of my Democratic colleagues a suggestion that what has allowed this to happen is not, in fact, the fact that the U.S. government has literally funded Hamas, literally given money that has gone to Hamas, literally funded what Ms. Nomami was referring to, my term, not hers, the anti-Semitic industrial complex. Instead, it's a desire to withdraw some funding from the Office of Civil Rights within the U.S. Department of Education. Let me ask the question. At what point did the Office of Civil Rights inside the U.S. Department of Education do a darn thing about this? At what point did they stop funding from going to Hamas? At what point did they call for a halt to U.S. government funding of the anti-Semitism industrial complex? They didn't, they can't. He's talking about the wrong enemy. The enemy is before us. It's found in university colleges and administrations and in the prior administration for not doing anything at all about this. Ms. Gohab, with President Trump's administration prioritizing and escalating efforts to eradicate anti-Semitism on our college and university campuses in America, have you noticed any universities making reforms in response to that?
Not specifically, but I do understand from what I speak to students, which, by the way, I speak to students almost daily, students who are on campuses not only on the East Coast, but on the West Coast and the South and up North. And for the most part, they say that universities, for the first time, are seeming to take anti-Semitism seriously. They're no longer bending knees. What you saw at Columbia and at Barnard was a tragedy. This happened a week ago when students took over a building again. I mean, there's actually a video of the dean asking for permission from the protesters to use the restroom. We can't see that anymore. We can't see that at all. At the same time, I do want to say that it seems that the new administration, because they're putting teeth finally behind the civil rights acts that we've been begging to be enforced, administrations are finally making a difference. Take, for example, NYU, which I filed my case against them in 2019, and then there was another case filed against them in 2023. They've changed their policies to have an anti-Zionism section that straight up says that you cannot use Zionism as a litmus test to let students in or out of spaces. You cannot ask students whether or not they're Zionists. You cannot have Zionist-free spaces. That's a huge step forward. I really think that administrations have started realizing that they were privileging activism over academics to the detriment of not only their Jewish population, but to any student who might think differently.
often using contrived, supposed, but really false inadequacies in the law as a justification for it. Either an interpretation of the First Amendment that it really can't be reconciled with First Amendment jurisprudence, or in some cases, supposed inadequacies of the civil rights laws that don't exist. Now, the Anti-Semitism Task Force plans, at least initially, to visit the following 10 schools: Columbia, George Washington, Harvard, Johns Hopkins, New York, Northwestern, UCLA, Berkeley, Minnesota, and USC. Are there other schools that you would add to that list that ought to be at the top?
How much time do you have? I do think that every single Ivy League school is to blame. I think that there's some schools that can be studied. So, for example, there are studies like in Florida or schools in Georgia that immediately shut down the encampments. Even, for example, at Princeton, they put out a statement after the encampments at NYU and Columbia where they said any student who attempts to encamp will be suspended and possibly removed from the university. They had 2-3 students try to encamp and it was shut down immediately. I think if I'm thinking of other hotspots, was Berkeley on your list? Stanford?
It was not. So I'm sure there are lots of others that could be mentioned. Maybe we can cover those in a subsequent meeting. Ms. Nomami, what tools does the U.S. Department of Justice have at its disposal to go after those suspected of committing hate crimes against Jewish Americans?
Well, we have to prosecute. And to your earlier point, what has happened is that this anti-Israel industrial complex, as you very eloquently put it, has created franchises at these various universities that have taken money from these malign foreign influence actors. I would add Georgetown University to your list, where I taught journalism, George Mason University, UC Berkeley. They are creating this conveyor belt of radicals that are now going into our streets and on our campuses. The efforts that the Justice Department has to do is, one, investigate the malign foreign influence. Behind me, you will probably recognize the familiar color of the Code Pink activists. And what is unspoken oftentimes is the fact that a man by the name of Neville Roy Singham has helped to fund this Chinese propaganda against America, using Israel, for example, and Jews as now a Trojan horse to have this kind of hate. We have to stop those malign foreign actors. The signs that I've shown you include this lovely manifesto from the America's Communist generation, the American Communist Party. So these are malign foreign actors that are in the United States of America, and they want to overthrow our system as we know it. And to me, that is the most serious way that we can try to dismantle their network.
Marxism and anti-Semitism make a wicked combination. They tend to go together. Yeah. Senator Klobuchar.
Thank you, Senator Lee. I believe, as a former prosecutor, having seen some of this firsthand, and the fear and the danger is that we must stand up and speak out against hate crimes and anti-Semitism whenever they occur. To me, this means the basic idea of making sure that we prioritize with law enforcement enforcement of our laws, hate crimes. It also means ensuring funding for the nonprofit grant program, which I was involved in early on when we started to expand it, and funding security upgrades at our synagogues, at our nonprofit organizations, and places of worship. It's critical that students feel safe in their schools, and it is also critical we allow peaceful protests. This is important in my state. Minnesota has a very strong and sizable Jewish population. We also have a sizable and strong Muslim population. And I always remember, as I look at how sometimes things do work, I look at one point when one of our Jewish community centers nearby where I grew up got a hateful threat call, and the kids ran out in their swimming suits in the middle of the winter. The seniors who were there for classes out without no coats, and they were, as they said, wandering in the wilderness in the middle of the snow. And when they got back in, when the threat was assessed and they were allowed back in the center, they checked their answers on their phone calls, and the first one that they had gotten was from our Islamic Center, offering them a place to meet and a place to go. So that's what guides me as I think about what we want to see more of in this country. So I'm going to focus on you, Mr. Rachlin, although I do appreciate all the witnesses. Minnesota, just last year, as many as 25 Jewish schools and religious facilities received bomb threats. We also had threats on mosques, and we actually had a pretty severe bombing at a mosque that was investigated by the FBI years ago, and people were prosecuted that were white supremacists. In your testimony, you said that the fear of anti-Semitism has become commonplace for too many American Jews. Could you talk about how we could better direct ways for the public to help out on this? Our U.S. attorney that from the last administration, Andy Luger, who's Jewish and really created a good working relationship with our Muslim community, prioritized working to build community relations, including meeting with those at Temple Israel in Minneapolis after their synagogue was defaced, making sure the community was informed. Could you talk a little bit about that?
So first, thank you so much for the question, and I also want to thank you for mentioning the Nonprofit Security Grant Program. I know I speak for everyone up here and for the vast majority of the Jewish community that it is one of the most vital programs that Congress has passed, and it allows us to feel safe in our communities. That being said, to your point of what else can be done, hardening targets can only get us so far. Providing armed security guards and bulletproof glass and different kinds of methods to keep us safe within buildings only gets us halfway there. I think the example you brought up about the Islamic Center texting out about the different people and trying to get them to come in while they were out in the cold when there was a bomb threat, I think that speaks volumes. I've worked in the peace building space in Israel and Palestine, and one of the biggest things I've noticed is the ability to bring people together, and I think that's absolutely critical. And so when we're looking at ways to combat anti-Semitism and to end it writ large, you have to look at things beyond hardening targets. I would strongly recommend people to invest in coalition building processes, bringing communities from across the spectrum together to actually have constructive conversations, to teach, to create a shared language of what is and what isn't anti-Semitism, and even beyond that, what is hate and what's not.
So social media, this committee is determined to do more on that, especially I think this Congress. Senator Grassley's long been involved in this, and of course protecting speech. But when we look at things like pornography, fentanyl sold online, impact social media is having on spreading hate. Could you talk a little bit about that? Is there enough being done online? Because I'm afraid this is instigating some of this.
I would say absolutely not. I think more needs to be done online. I think one of the major drivers of anti-Semitism online is the X platform, the platform formerly known as Twitter, with the removal of safeguards and with Mr. Musk ascending to run that company, we've seen a massive increase in anti-Semitism being propagated on that platform and spreading out from there. And that's just one platform. That's not even talking about Meta or the other social media platforms. So I think there needs to be more done to actually bring them to heel, to understand what is anti-Semitism, and to actually stop, in many cases, those CEOs that run those organizations from pushing those theories out farther.
Okay. Last question. I pressed FBI Director Patel to prioritize thoroughly investigating hate crimes against all communities, including the Jewish community, and he agreed. What steps do you think the FBI, since we are the federal body here in the Senate, can take to making combating hate crimes a priority?
So one, I would think that, I would hope that the FBI and the new administration would actually refer back to the 2023 strategy that was supported by Jews across the spectrum, and actually look at this not just from an FBI perspective, but from a whole of society perspective. How do we do this as a society to actually eradicate anti-Semitism? And I think that is the larger question, rather than isolating on the FBI.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Senator Kennedy.
Thank you all for being here. Ms. Solomon, I want to be sure I understand your testimony. Did I understand you to testify that anti-Semitism is worse under the Trump administration?
Senator, thank you for your question.
You don't have to thank me. Okay. Your best thanks is to answer.
Okay. Well, I'll tell you that anti-Semitism has been rising, especially since the 2017
but has the Trump
Charlottesville
administration
attack.
caused that? Is that your testimony?
I wouldn't say the Trump administration has caused anti-Semitism. Has there been an increase since Trump has entered office? Yes.
Do you see a causal connection there?
Yes.
Why?
Trump has highlighted and platformed neo-Nazis and white supremacists.
Okay. Mr. I can't see that far.
Racklin.
Mr. Racklin, I understood you to say that in answer to Senator Durbin's question, the spending reductions, reducing the federal budget would increase anti-Semitism. Isn't that what you said?
No, I did not. I said that the constant threats to cut money to the Office for Civil Rights and the Department of Education prevents the federal government from adequately investigating anti-Semitism and other hate crimes on college campuses.
So you think one way to stop anti-Semitism is to give people more money? Is that right?
I think one of the ways is to actually fund people that are actually designed to investigate anti-Semitism on college campuses.
What's there to investigate? We see it.
We saw it.
Did you watch television? Did you see what happened at Columbia?
Absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, it was clear to me that the administration at Columbia and most members of the faculty believed passionately in diversity, equity, inclusion, and the right to hurt Jews. That's what I saw. Isn't that what you saw?
I saw.
Isn't that what you saw?
I saw protesters against the war in Gaza and them using some anti-Semitic slogans and thoughts. I would say, however, that it's hard. I would say,
isn't that
however,
what you're telling me? That's not what you saw. Now, don't get off the subject on me now. You're telling me that's not what you saw.
I'm telling you that it is difficult for the federal government to adequately address the issue of anti-Semitism.
Are you telling me the Columbia administration and the faculty was supportive of the Jewish community?
I think that they are trying to
You need to stop dipping into your ketamine stash.
Into what? Excuse me?
Now, if we're going to solve this problem, we need to talk about it. And it wasn't just at Columbia. It was at Berkeley. It was at UCLA. It was at Barnard. And Columbia has a history of discriminating against Jewish people. They used to refuse to let Jewish students come to their university. Now, you can try to bubble wrap this, but that's what I saw. If you want to stop a lot of the anti-Semitism, maybe we need to stop teaching kids to be anti-Semitic.
Sir, I would relish that opportunity.
Let me ask you a question, Ms. Kohab. Did I say that right?
Kohab.
Do you think it's possible to feel compassion for the Palestinian people without hating Jews?
Absolutely.
Would you elaborate on that? Because it looks to me like many of our Ivy League universities, they weren't the only ones. Some universities handled it well. Vanderbilt, University of Chicago, Tulane. But it looks like the administration was teaching kids you got to pick a side. Mm-hmm. You either have to hate Jews or you have to be for Hamas. You can't be. There's no middle ground. Tell me what you saw. You've written a book about it. Maybe Mr. Rocklin ought to read it.
Just because we are testifying, I wrote a chapter in the anthology Young Zionist Voices about what's happening on college campuses, and my book is coming soon, so look out for that.
Good plug, but
so let me answer your question.
Can you feel compassion for the Palestinian people and not hate Jews?
Absolutely. I think that what I've seen on college campuses is a pushing of a Marxist framing of the way that you see the world. And this is not only in liberal studies departments. I've taken dance classes, I've taken creative writing classes, where your final project is literally called The Political is Personal. And what they're teaching you on college campuses is that the political is personal and that everything should be personalized. And there's a global north, a global south, a global right, and a global wrong. And the issue with college campuses and what's happening right now in the United States is that we're allowing ideology to drive violence. A society that says that you can commit violent acts based on your ideology because your ideology is correct is a society that's eroding, and that's what I see on college campuses. Now, you asked if I could feel Palestinian peoplehood, right? If I could feel compassion for the Palestinian people. Absolutely. And every night when I go to bed, yes, I pray for the Jewish people, but I also pray for the Palestinian people, for God to send them leaders that actually care more about their safety. Leaders that put their people's safety in order to propel an ideology at risk aren't leaders. If you look at Hamas, they tout what happened after October 7th up until this day as a victory. How can you lie in rubble after thousands of your people have died and call that a victory? So what I see that has to happen on college campuses is de-radicalization. Until you admit that there's a radical ideology happening on a college campus, you cannot fight it. You cannot fight it.
Senator Arano, hey, I know there's a lot of strong feelings in here. We all have them, but each member only has 5 minutes, and it just takes time away from their 5 minutes if you really want to get all these facts out. Ms. Arano.
Mr. Chairman, thank you all for testifying. And I recognize how important this issue is because, of course, there was a time when we had a lot of focus on the attacks on the Asian American, Pacific Islander, Native Hawaiian community, especially during COVID. So the safety of especially our minority community members is always an issue in this country. And we have not, in my view, done a particularly good job of making sure that people are safe. I do have a question for Mr. Racklin. Now, I mean, we have an administration that is totally obsessed with DEI. To the point where they want they've put out the word that any reference to diversity, equity, and inclusion should be wiped out of all of the websites of our administration, including to agencies that get federal money. So I will give you an example of how ridiculous all of this is in my view. I met with a group of people from the Department of Agriculture in Hawaii, and that they had to remove reference to diverse crops. And now you know that equity is also involved in things like equity in your house. So this, what I would call the obsession with DEI has been very weaponized. Mr. Racklin, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, which is a longstanding law, prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. We already have a law. We already have a law that prohibits discriminatory hiring, for example, and also in employment, et cetera. We already have that. So what I don't get is why there's all this anti-DEI fervor that I think adds to the kind of discrimination and divisiveness in our country.
So
do you have any thoughts about what's happening with DEI and how it's not helping in addressing discrimination in our country?
First, thank you, and thank you for pronouncing my name correctly. But I would say this regarding to DEI and what exactly you said about Title VII is one, we have laws on the books. The ability to attack DEI initiatives and the continuous obsession with them does nothing but create division within our society. If the administration was truly interested in actually addressing this, they would look for ways to actually bring different populations together and different communities together rather than labeling things as diversity, equity, inclusion, and trying to divide them apart. It's a very strange obsession that I've noticed over the last several months, actually.
I think that it's definitely become weaponized as far as I'm concerned. And the DEI is blamed for everything by people who obviously have not faced the kind of discrimination that truly should be illegal. It already is, frankly. I have to share with you one other instance during the horrific incident with the plane crashing into the Potomac. And the president says, oh, it's only common sense that we should blame DEI. I found that astounding because he drew the conclusion that somehow people of color, women and people of color, has something to do with this crash. And I can tell you, I was so appalled by his comment that I said there is absolutely nothing common sense about it, that his reference that DEI should be blamed in that instance and in just about every other instance that he can think of. I said this is just sexist, racist, and I basically used the term BS, but I won't say that here, but you get my meaning. Okay, for Ms. Solomon. During our last hate crimes hearing, we discussed the value of civic education and heard a call for universities to develop courses focused on engaging in difficult conversations. And universities are supposed to be the heart of civil discourse. And I have long supported civics education in our schools. We certainly could do more. Ms. Solomon, do you think schools and universities are doing enough education on civil discourse?
Thank you so much, Senator Hirono, for the question. I do think some universities, like my own university, Tufts University, is doing a remarkable job of educating its students about their civic duties in this country and beyond. But I do think there's always ways that we can do more. This past year, Tufts University established an educational initiative for its freshman orientation in which they included anti-Semitism education as well as education around Islamophobia. I think that this is a model for other colleges and universities to adapt to their own campuses in order to stem the tide of hate crimes across this country.
One would think that the university setting is especially appropriate as a place where different ideas can be contemplated and debated. And as a person who, basically I matriculated during the Vietnam War. I was at the University of Hawaii where I protested, and it is one of the activities that awaken my sense of civic responsibility. Thank you very much to all of you.
Senator Schmidt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for having this hearing. And it occurred to me as I'm just listening here that the Democrats have a real problem on their hands. There's a growing wing, Hamas wing of their party. So in a really tough spot to have these conversations. So I'm glad you had this. And it's also the reason why Josh Shapiro wasn't picked to be vice president, the nominee. I mean, this is just the hard calculus that Kamala Harris made, is that it would upset the pro-Hamas wing of the Democrat Party, and she's worried about losing Michigan. That's the truth. So we can dance around all this all we want. So I'm glad we're having an open hearing for everyone to see, because after October 7th, a couple weeks later, I went on the Senate floor, and if you want to understand, you shouldn't actually be that surprised by what's happening on college campuses if you appreciate what's been taught now for at least a generation. And my friend on the other side wanted to understand the obsession with DEI. So do I. Because DEI is rooted in cultural Marxism. And cultural Marxism divides the room by immutable characteristics, principally by race. Every room is oppressor versus oppressed. So this idea of intersectionality is you group all the oppressed versus the oppressor. And guess what happens on that totem pole? On the totem pole of oppression, the Jews lose out because they're considered white or the oppressor, and it's very, very dangerous. So if you want to understand why this is happening on college campuses, is because they're viewing the room by oppressor versus oppressed. And it's terrible. It's a terrible road to go down. I do want to ask Ms. Nomani, I want to ask you a couple of questions that are related to this. So you, in your book, Woke Army, looked into the unholy alliance between radical Muslims who preach jihad against Western freedoms and far left activists whose divisive ideology turns all the societal issues into a race war, end quote. Who's funding? Right. Who's funding this alliance? Who's funding Samadoun? Who's funding within our lifetime?
Yeah, this is exactly why this committee is a perfect place to answer that question for our country. The Justice Department must investigate those funding, and exactly, in my book, the very first individuals from the cast of characters is Hatem Bazian from University of California at Berkeley, creating American Muslims for Palestine. Where is this base? The base is not far from where I live in Northern Virginia, at a place called 500 Grove Street, Senator Schmidt. And 500 Grove Street is the hub of these Islamist organizations in the United States. They are the legacy organizations of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is dedicated to the global caliphate and the destruction of the state of Israel. Qatar is funding these organizations. Saudi Arabia has been funding these organizations. Turkey is funding these organizations. Iran, China, Russian oligarchs, and others. this is malign foreign influence in our United States. And to the point that was made about the ideologues, this is Answer Coalition. They're using Free Palestine. Does anyone in this room know who Answer Coalition is? It's a socialist, Marxist, communist, self-declared organization.
Yes.
They are the ones that get the petitions for these protests that end up with the American flag being burnt. So we have to follow the money, Senator, absolutely.
I agree, and I think we're just getting started. And I think some of these NGOs that have been funded by USAID, there ought to be a bigger microscope on that too, because I think it's going to be terrifying what we find. And I also think you mentioned earlier, the cultural Marxism aspect that undergirds all of this relies on this constant churning, right? This constant churning, and it's also in corporate America too. Yes. These modern day struggle sessions that people have to go through, it's ridiculous. It's ridiculous, and I think, thank God, President Trump won, because we're going to root this stuff out. It has no place. So if we really want to understand, I think what's happening on the college campuses is sort of the symptom of a much deeper problem, right? Which is and by the way, it's not just on college campuses anymore. If you want to understand what critical race theory is, and they'll say, well, there's no class on critical race theory. Well, there doesn't need to be a class on critical race theory if all of your trainings, all your professional development is rooted in critical race theory, which again is based in cultural Marxism. So all this stuff needs to be exposed. And so I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing here today.
Before I call on Senator Schiff, I'd like to draw the committee's attention to a letter from Rabbi Abraham Cooper of the Simon Wiesenthal Center. In 2023, this center approached me with allegations of wrongdoing. Those allegations centered on Credit Suisse historic servicing of Nazi accounts during and following World War II. As then ranking member of the Budget Committee, I asked Senator Whitehouse, then chairman of the committee, to join me in opening an investigation, which now continues under my chairmanship of this committee. Although 78 years have passed since Nazis surrendered following the war that resulted in 75 million deaths, there's still much to learn about the Holocaust. Recently, after I sent a letter to Senator Milei of Argentina, he agreed to opening previously sealed Nazi archives in that country. So I wanted to give my thanks to him and the tenacity of the Simon Wiesenthal Center for their efforts to uncover the truth. So without objection, I'll include this in the record. Senator Schiff.
Senator, I'd like to ask permission to enter into the record a statement from the Jewish Council on Urban Affairs, a 61-year-old organization in the community of Chicago, and ask that it be included in the record.
Without objection, that will be included in the record as well. Senator Schiff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Chairman, for holding this hearing. I think for those of us in the Jewish community, the shock of October 7th was one thing. The scale of it, the barbarism of it, the torture, the rape, the murder, the continuing depravity of it. But the unleashing of the wave of anti-Semitism was another shock that I think we're still trying to grapple with, and we've had to come to recognize that this ancient scourge is always with us. It is never far from the surface, always there to be tapped. I'd like to ask about the disturbing presence of anti-Semitism on the left and on the right, because I think we have a problem coming from both directions. On the left, I wonder if you could shed light on why it seems that at some of our academic institutions that are known for their strongest academic excellence, we see some of the most prevalence of anti-Semitism. Is it because they're a magnet for people who come from off campus, or is there something else going on that we should be aware of? And in terms of anti-Semitism from the right, what are we to make of the use of these Nazi salutes by some of the thought leaders of the Republican Party, the Trump Republican Party, like Steve Bannon or Elon Musk. What are we to make of a vice president unwilling to meet with the mainstream German chancellor, but eager to meet with the alt-right party leader? This embrace of the alt-right at home and abroad, what are we to make of that? And how are we to reconcile that with a claim of being opposed to anti-Semitism? So if I could start, Mr. Racklin, with you on the right, and Ms. Hallman, if you could address the issue on campus from the left.
Thank you, Mr. Schiff. I really appreciate the question. I completely agree. The rapid coming forth and normalization of anti-Semitism from the right is deeply, deeply disturbing. And it extends beyond Steve Bannon and Mr. Musk. We've seen secretaries in this cabinet, as well as other administration officials, propagate the Great Replacement theory, which is basically says that Jews are trying to replace the white race, and it also disseminates farther beyond that as well. What I find most troubling is there seems to be an inability to reconcile on the right and in the conservative movement that anti-Semitism is real and that they're unwilling to seem to confront it. And I would actually point to the Heritage Foundation's Project Esther, which completely dismisses right-wing anti-Semitism as non-existent. That kind of language is just not true. The vast majority of violence comes from the right. But I would also say, to your point, anti-Semitism is a whole society problem. It is something that we have to address as a whole society, right and left. There is anti-Semitism on both sides. And so it's going to require a comprehensive approach to eradicate it from our society.
Thank you. And Ms. Solomon, things seem better on college campuses this year, thankfully. But how do you comprehend the challenge, and why does it seem so much more prevalent on institutions known for their academic excellence?
Thank you so much, Senator, for the question. I think centers of academic excellence, such as our institutes of higher education in this country, are places of dialogue, and dialogue can sometimes enter spaces, unfortunately, of hatred and division if they are not facilitated correctly and with empathy and with nuance. You asked me to speak a little bit about anti-Semitism on the left that I've seen on my college campus, which is sometimes a little bit harder to root out because it's not as openly Nazi-like as the right-wing anti-Semitism we see today that is supported by people, as you have mentioned. Many Jewish students, including myself, have been excluded from certain progressive groups on campus. I personally know also students who have been bullied out of housing because their affiliation with Jewish groups. And this has nothing to do with Israel. This simply has to do with us being Jewish. It also means, Tufts University also had an issue with student groups boycotting different Jewish groups on campus, simply, again, because they are Jewish, nothing to do with Israel-Palestine or their conflict. I do want to say that I'm really thankful to be here as the only student on this panel to represent a student experience that I think is actually part of the vast majority of student experiences, but has not been heard previously in previous committee hearings because it is much easier to listen to students who are on the more extreme or radical side. It is much harder to listen to students like me who have a much more nuanced perspective and nuanced experience over the past year and a half.
Thank you, Ms. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Schiff. Appreciate all of the witnesses being here today. This is obviously an incredibly important hearing, specifically held to address anti-Semitism. And, we will never address it, we will never fix it unless we have people on both sides making true representation. I was very surprised to have one witness blame our recent president for anti-Semitism when college campuses were overtaken and Jewish students had criminal acts perpetrated against them under a different administration. But I also thought it was interesting that we blamed the right for not admitting anti-Semitism is real when you have heard every one of us say, what are we going to do to address it? In Florida, and I appreciate the compliment for our universities, we did not see the incredibly dangerous, reckless, offensive criminal behavior that we saw on college campuses around the nation, but that doesn't happen by accident. As soon as we saw this popping up, I was Attorney General. Leadership in Tallahassee was very clear. This is a law and order state. It will not happen. We communicated directly with our presidents. And not only that, I communicated directly with our chiefs of police, instructed them on the laws, the criminal laws that we were seeing, that people should be arrested for. And we specifically communicated with our state attorneys and said, if they are arrested, the last thing you should do is advocate that they get right back out and go right back to the university. As we saw in other states, this is proactive ways to stop this behavior before it destroys any semblance of sanity and peace and structure and free speech among a university. And so I'm really interested in some of the statements that maybe we give additional funding to stop this behavior. I think that's incredibly insane. In fact, I heard Senator Lee talk about, are we using all of the tools at DOJ to stop this? I think maybe we should examine, since federal funding flows to universities, maybe we should examine when universities are accused of allowing violations of the Civil Rights Act, and maybe when there are court opinions that actually make findings to suggest that has actually happened, maybe we should start clawing back federal funding that's already been given to them. That's a thought. And maybe, just maybe, the thing that happened last week where the university president asked permission in the middle of a protest of the protesters if he could go to the bathroom, maybe that wouldn't be happening if he thought maybe his federal funding might be clawed back. I was just wondering what you thought about that, Ms. Cohab.
Thank you. That's a great question. I think that something has to be held over the university's heads, because unless something happens and something changes and there's actual consequences, why would you change your actions? Look, I don't think the overwhelming majority of administrators are inherently anti-Semitic. I think they're lazy. And I think that they know that fighting anti-Semitism takes work, and it's not something that's easy. And yes, you're going to make some people angry, especially the kinds of students that you've been educating to be angry about everything. If you're admitting the kind of student who takes over buildings, don't be surprised when the kind of students take over buildings led by their very professors. That's the thing. We keep saying that there's an issue in higher education, but we have our head in the sand as to how to fix it. I think that consequences are absolutely necessary. Filing my complaint was enough to get NYU to the table for a settlement, but that wasn't even close to changing what happened. After October 7th, you still saw encampments at NYU, and they still had another case against them. I think that the law changes very slowly, and that the only way to hold people accountable is to make sure that there are consequences on the other side.
And Ms. Lewin, I'll ask you same question. Do you believe if we had additional tools provided by the government that allowed for a clawback of federal funds if universities were found to have allowed or even facilitated civil rights violation, do you think that would help in combating anti-Semitism on campuses? And you can answer briefly.
Absolutely, Senator Moody. I think that what we need most is to hold the universities accountable. The law is a very powerful motivator. And what we've seen is that just the threat of withholding the funds or clawing back the funds has already motivated universities to act. And I would suggest to you, quite frankly, that university administrators, when we've negotiated settlements with them, some of them are actually very relieved to be able to point to the law and to be able to say, we now have to do this because the law requires us to do it. And it gives them the backbone, which they otherwise seem to lack, to actually stand up and push back against the Jew hatred that's happening on their campus. So it's absolutely necessary to hold their feet to the fire and to impose these rules and show that violating them and violating Title VI has consequences.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here today on this really supremely important topic. I think all of us on this panel were horrified to see what happened on our campuses and what happened in many other public spaces in the wake of October 7th. I have visited Israel numerous times since October 7th, but one of the memories that is seared in my mind is a conversation in the War Cabinet with Prime Minister Netanyahu and a number of the other ministers shortly after October 7th, and they played the videos. Some of it has now become public. Then it was not, and some of what we saw has not been made public, but it was the most stomach-turning, absolutely sickening pictures that I've ever seen. And one of the ministers said, pointing to the video, you know, throughout our history, the Jewish people have had to run and hide. Israel was supposed to be a place where we no longer had to run and hide. These people tried to run and hide. We cannot tolerate this anymore. And I think someone understanding that view can also understand why the violence, the threats of violence, the taunts and other stuff that occurred on campuses and throughout the world after October 7th raised such fears among the people who were targets of it. And so I thank you for being here today to talk intelligently and objectively, as dispassionately as anyone can, about this issue and what we can do in a legal sense, preserving the First Amendment, the right of free expression, and hopefully doing it in a way, as we've always done, to allocate time, place, and manner restrictions that make sense on college campuses, just as they would in the public square. And I think it is a continuing conversation that we're going to have to pursue on the definition, for example, of anti-Semitism. I'm not sure we have exactly the right answer, but I think that we need to talk in good faith among ourselves about what the right answer is. I'm an enforcer by training and by career. I'm a prosecutor. I did it as United States Attorney, the Chief Federal Prosecutor in Connecticut for 4.5 years. I did it as Attorney General of Connecticut for 20 years. So for me, enforcement of civil rights, to protect civil rights, is very, very important. And I'm very deeply troubled by the plan to dismantle the Office of Civil Rights in the Department of Education, which the new secretary has said she will do. She's going to dismantle the whole Department of Education. But the Office of Civil Rights, definitely, she's said, should no longer exist. If anyone here is in favor of dismantling the Office of Civil Rights, I'd like to hear you tell me why you should. And Mr. Rachlin, I know in your testimony you've strongly supported the continuation of the Office of Civil Rights. Maybe you can begin by telling me why.
The Office for Civil Rights at the Department of Education is, as Ms. Kohab has said as well, one of the avenues for students to actually bring discrimination cases to a head. I think that this office is absolutely critical in being able to do real investigations on what is happening on campus and actually working with school administrators to actually come to a equitable outcome for that. If there is criminal intent, if there is discrimination involved, then I would say that it jumps into discrimination law rather than Department of Education. So I would say, like, in this space, OCR is absolutely vital to the kids that are Jewish, non-Jews, all across the country, to help address those issues.
Thank you, Senator Blumenthal.
Thank you.
Senator Britt.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Want to thank Chairman Grassley for calling this hearing. I think it is so important that this committee does this work, and I wish that this committee had addressed this before now, but certainly appreciate his leadership in doing this. I had the opportunity to travel with Senator Blumenthal, my friend across the aisle, to Israel after October 7th. And to echo his words, what we saw was unimaginable. couldn't wrap my head around it. It was gut-wrenching. It was heartbreaking. It was just out of the bounds of what you thought anyone was capable of doing. And when we came home to see what then occurred on college campuses here, I could not have been more disgusted. Not only what happened, but what was allowed to happen at what some believe or consider to believe some of our most elite institutions. So I look at that and take a step back, and you think about what Jewish students dealt with. And bottom line, Jewish students should have never been prohibited from entering sections of the campus because of who they were. Yet that happened at UCLA. Jewish students should have never had to navigate a professor tweeting out that Hamas's barbaric attacks constituted, quote, such an amazing day, exclamation point. But that happened at Yale. Jewish students should have never had to experience a professor referring to Hamas attack as something that was, quote, exhilarating and energizing. But that happened at Cornell. And Jewish students should have never had to have tolerated comments such as that, quote, October 7th is going to be every day for you, end quote, or, quote, yes, Hamas, we love you. We support your rockets too, end quote. But that, among many other things, happened at Columbia. These schools and their administrations who tolerated this, who allowed this to happen, it's repulsive. They brought shame on themselves. We have to take what we've learned from this, and we have to make sure that it never happens again. They've repeatedly proven that they deserve no benefit of the doubt at all in how they're going to handle anti-Semitism. I'm glad that both Congress and the Trump administration have said this is going to be a priority, and I'm proud to be a co-sponsor of a number of bills from the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act to Countering Anti-Semitism Act, amongst a number of others that are going to hit this head on. But I want to ask a couple of questions. Mrs. Lewin, I know that the Brandeis Center undertakes a great deal of research and legal advocacy in this space. But because of that, though, I'm interested in your view of what steps Congress actually needs to take to strengthen Title VI as it relates to combating anti-Semitism and just a hostile educational environment and those claims in courts. You know, is it a matter of simply adding discrimination based on the religion to the statute? Is it better to clarify what constitutes actual discrimination on the basis of race or national origin? Or do we need to codify the 2004 Marcus policy? What is it that we actually need to do to make sure that this doesn't happen again?
Thank you very much, Senator Britt. I think start off with adopting the IHRA definition, right? Let's codify the Executive Order 13899. Okay. That's really important because that will help us understand and recognize the difference between, as I've said, a legitimate political debate and the vilification of Jews. When you demonize, apply a double standard, or delegitimize not only individual Jews, but the Jewish collective, the Jewish nation state of Israel, that's not criticism of Israel similar to that leveled against any other country. We need that definition because we need to be able to start teaching our society how to define and understand the difference between the two. And then I do think we need to give whatever strength we can, as Senator Moody was saying, to make sure that we're holding accountable anybody who is violating Title VI, and that includes
removing federal funding.
Yes,
halting
exactly.
It. Stop. Why would we give you money if you were violating Title VI?
Correct, because what needs to be understood, as you said when you talked about the Marcus policy from 2004, is that when faith-based groups are targeted on the basis of their shared ancestry or ethnicity, that is a violation of Title VI. If you see groups that are being denied the equal access to educational opportunities because of their shared ancestry and ethnicity, so when you have folks on campus who are encircling Jews, spinning at Jews, cutting the Jews out, saying to the Jews, you're not welcome, not only in my club, you can't go through the encampment. I've had students who have told us that there are students who will get up, they won't sit next to them because they're a Zionist. They won't allow them in their plays because they're a Zionist. They won't include them in any of their activities. They are being shunned, they're being marginalized, and it is not a conversation about the Arab-Israeli conflict. I will just say, because it's one story that I think is important to be heard about how this is not a
I could say that
political
very
debate.
briefly. I know
Okay.
that Senator Britt's run out of her time, but if
Go
you
ahead.
would like to
I
wrap
will,
that
I
up
will
very
do it at the
briefly.
end. In a different question, then I'll give that answer.
Okay,
I hope somebody gives her an opportunity to say that.
I hope so.
Hey, thanks, guys. Appreciate it. Appreciate it.
I think Senator Welch would be upset with me as chair if I let everyone go past. Senator Welch, go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair. You're moving.
Over here.
You're moving fast.
I am, sir.
And that's tough to do when you're sitting next to Senator Britt. Thank you all very much. You know, it's amazing. We have a wonderful state in Vermont, and it's a very tolerant state, but we're having a very alarming increase in anti-Semitism. It's not just October 7. We saw that before. Obviously, October 7 has intensified it. And I know all of you are living with it in a very real way. So I just want to express to you my gratitude that each of you is here. You know, the question is often, and rightly so, what's hate speech, what's fair speech? But there's also another reality, that there is real anti-Semitic behavior towards people in our communities. And, you know, I think about the Tree of Life and just the hate that inspired that. So even if on the panel there's disagreements about what's the best way to go, I think there's unity about making certain that everything that we can do, we will do to address anti-Semitism. I'll just ask a couple of questions here after expressing my gratitude for each of you. Mr. Racklin, you know, the President's issued an executive order, and obviously it's intended to try to address some of the concerns that several of the folks at the panel here have addressed. By definition, there's going to be a big argument about whether it goes too far or it doesn't go far enough. And by definition, any order that comes out is going to raise free speech questions that are going to be really debated. I just want you to have an opportunity to express your views on the orders regarding the political activities of international students. And should there be a distinction between the speech of a person who is here as an international student versus a person who is a citizen of the country?
Thank you so much, Mr. Welch. Just speaking for Nexus, we at this time don't have a policy on foreign students. However, I would point out that the national strategy, which was, again, put together with 1,000 Jewish communal leaders that had broad bipartisan support, that was the basis for the Countering Anti-Semitism Act, which the vast majority of this committee supported, does not talk about deporting students in any way, shape, or form. It is not one of their recommendations. Moreover, I would take a step back, and recently, the Jewish Council for Public Affairs, the Reform Movement, and the Conservative Movement led a letter of 100 different organizations speaking directly to the idea of deportation of individuals by this administration. And what they've said is that the scapegoating and dehumanization of immigrants, people of color, transgender people, and other marginalized groups to justify draconian and unconstitutional policies, these ideas fundamentally threaten the freedom and safety of all Americans. So I think that there needs to be an that regardless of how you think, it's important to listen to the vast majority of the community very skeptical of this type of action. But I think overall, when you look at this national strategy that I have right in front of me right here, it doesn't say anything about that. Okay. And that came with so much endorsement from the community.
I want to thank you. I want to go, Ms. Solomon, can you just give us some sense of what you think endangers dialogue among students? You've got a lot of experience at Tufts. Are there things that we can do that allow for robust debate but mutual respect?
Thank you so much for your question, Senator Welch. I think that, as you said before, universities must differentiate between protected speech and threats of violence. But I think what's even more important is that dialogue can be had, best be had, on the basis of education. If we are not aware of what is happening, we cannot have constructive dialogue about what is happening. And what I find issue with is when we are actively seeing people advocate for the cutting of federal funding to OCR, which is free and is often the only way for Jewish students to access avenues of advocacy, we are seeing that being threatened. I don't understand how we are able to encourage higher education institutes to be able to have these dialogues if there are so many political leaders advocating for the foundation of them to be cut off.
That was very helpful. I'm just going to give you a chance. What about OCR? I mean, that does seem like a pretty serious question. Yeah, Ms. Kojab, thank you very much.
And you can answer very briefly.
Very briefly. I don't advocate for the defunding of OCR, but at the same time, it wasn't defunded with nothing in place. They're replacing it with directed investigations. When I filed my case against NYU, OCR did open a complaint, and yet 3, 4, 5 years later, we see another lawsuit against NYU for the same exact thing, anti-Semitism. How do you get sued twice within 5 years for the same thing? Because whatever you did not work. So I'm not advocating for the defunding of OCR, but I am saying that at the same time, it has not been effective. Not a single school has lost their funding under Title VI, and it has not been enforced.
Thank you, Ms. Kohab. Thank you, Senator Welch. Senator Blackburn.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and thank you all for being here, for your time, for the preparation for the hearing, and for speaking out. I think one of the things that has been so troubling to many of us is to see what took place on college campuses, and they seemed to pay no price. There was no penalty. There was no corrective action. And I appreciated, Ms. Cohab, your listing of the schools that were doing things wrong. And you said, how much time do you have? Because the list goes on and on. Now, the Anti-Defamation League has said that Vanderbilt University gets an A for fighting anti-Semitic activity, for being neutral, institutionally neutral, and for supporting free speech. And being from Tennessee, we recognize and appreciate that good work that Vanderbilt University is doing to keep students safe and to encourage robust, respectful debate. And my hope is that we will see some of these elite universities turn to that and appreciate that. You know, this nation has stayed strong and free because we have allowed free speech in the public square. And to see what has taken place on some of these campuses. I think a mom I talked to who had a child at one of these elite universities said it best. They had spent money getting through high school, getting the best grades, being academically competitive, and feeling that they had opened her mind to want to experience the world and learn and appreciate others with diverse opinions and views and cultures. And they sent her to school, and every time she came home, they noticed it seemed to be her worldview was narrowing. And the point of concern that had for them, and I just think, Ms. Lewin, I want you to just briefly touch on what universities should be doing, could be doing, where they have gotten so far off track on this that no longer can a student feel safe asking the question or delivering a counterpoint. So I'll give it to you, and you can use that time to tell the story you wanted to tell with Ms. Britt.
Thank you very much. So universities, the first thing is they have to set the rules, and then they have to stick to them. They have to show that if you violate the rules, you will be held accountable. That's the most important thing that the universities have to do. But then they also need to be able to call out when there is a group on campus that is riling up the campus to turn against part of their community. And the story I was going to tell was about dialogue only works when you have willing participants. So Ms. Kochab talked about how in 2019 at NYU, there was a BDS, a boycott, divestment, sanction resolution that was adopted by the student government and endorsed by 53 student groups. But what was a little unusual at that time was that it called not only to boycott Israeli products and companies doing business with Israel, but to also boycott all of the Jewish organizations on campus, the pro-Israel groups, they called them. And you had then 53 student orgs that were saying, we're not going to engage with these Jewish students, we're not going to co-sponsor events with them or do projects with them. And so the university, to its credit, said, this is not a good thing to have so many of our students boycotting a group of our students. So they actually hired a professional facilitator to come in to try and facilitate a dialogue among these students. And I think Ms. Kochab was at that meeting. And so you had all these students who showed up, and the facilitator explained, we're not here, this is not a debate. We're not here to try and convince somebody I'm right, you're wrong. We're just going to go around the room and respectfully listen to one another. And what was supposed to be a 1.5-hour dialogue turned into a 2.5-hour discussion about whether the anti-Zionists would even talk to the Zionists. They said, we showed up here because we didn't want to risk losing our student government funding, but you can't force us to talk to one another. And I'm told that there was one Palestinian student in that room, and that student said, I don't understand it. The Jewish students seem to want to hear my story, but my allies won't let me tell it. And after 2.5 hours, the facilitator gave up. She said, I can't force you to talk. And she sent them home, and the university announced, we're not divesting from Israel, which is very nice, but it didn't do a thing to address this interpersonal tension between the students on the campus. Universities have to recognize that that's what's happening on the campus, the ostracizing, the marginalizing, the shunning of Jews, and they have to start addressing that.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Senator Hawley?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to all of the witnesses for being here. Let me say that I, too, am pleased that we're finally holding a hearing after years on this vitally important topic, particularly as these anti-Jewish, anti-Israel protests now erupt again on our college campuses, most of which, all of which, are getting massive amounts of federal funding. Mr. Rockland, is that how I say your name, by the way? Is it Rockland?
Rackland, just
Rackland.
R-A-C-K rather than
Rackland. Okay, I got it. All right. I'll see if I can adhere to that.
Appreciate it.
Let me just ask you, I just want to make sure that I heard you in response. I think it was to Senator Welch. Did you say that you're not in favor of canceling visas for foreign students who commit unlawful acts against Jewish students?
I said at this time, Nexus does not have a position on that, the organization I work for. And then I went on to describe how in the national strategy, it doesn't talk about that, doesn't recommend that, and that was done in consultation with 1,000 leaders across the board and was supported by the ADL, AJC, JFNA, J Street, all of us.
So you don't think that's not a good idea? I mean, why would we permit a foreign student who's here on a student visa who commits an act of violence, an unlawful act against a Jewish student? Why wouldn't we say, sorry, but if you're going to commit acts of violence against Jewish students, Jewish Americans or foreign Jewish students, whomever, we're going to revoke your visa. I mean, you're going home.
So I think on that issue itself, I'm trying to think now. It's not, when you're talking about acts of violence and you're talking about actually breaking U.S. law towards students, that is criminal. That should be done through the Justice Department. When we're talking about deportation, that's immigration. So if there is a criminal investigation that leads to deportation, I think that's perfectly acceptable.
Well, I'm talking about student visas. They're here on visas. They're here on particular.
Doing that.
Well, sure, but why don't we write into the process a condition of the visa that if you assault a Jewish student on campus, you're out of here. You're gone.
If it was written in the statute and if it was broad enough to be not just be for Jews, but for all people that have experienced discrimination, regardless of who they are, I think that we should look at that. But I think until that is in law, what I'm basing this on is what the current statute says and what currently is being done.
Well, listen, I guess I don't understand the hesitation here at all. To me, this is an easy call, and I've urged the current Secretary of State, Secretary Rubio, to do this, and I think he's got the authority to do it. My position is it would send an incredibly clear message. If you come to this country on a student visa, you are here as a guest of the United States for particular purposes. If you assault a Jewish student on campus, you ought to be out of here. And we ought to make it clear to people we are not going to tolerate it. We're not going to tolerate it for any reason. Can I just ask you why I have you here, Mr. Recklin?
Yeah,
I've heard you talk about DEI. I just want to be clear on this. You would agree, wouldn't you, that much of this DEI rhetoric has been weaponized against Jewish students? The DEI dialogue has been weaponized against them. They're called colonizers. They're called imperialists. They're called oppressors. It's the classic intersectionality DEI language. I'll give you some tangible examples. The DEI chair at MIT publicly issued statements calling Israel a genocidal apartheid state. You have the University of Washington's DEI office that sent out an email describing Israel as, once again, an unlawful and oppressive settler colonial apartheid state. The DEI program coordinator at Rutgers said to Jewish students, F you colonizer, F you Zionists. I mean, my point is, isn't it time to speak some truth to power here to these people and to say that Israel is not a colonizer state. It is not an apartheid state. Jewish students are not colonizers, and this kind of rhetoric shouldn't be weaponized against them. You'd agree with that, surely.
I would say that it's wrong to blame Jewish students for the actions of the state of Israel in any way, shape, or form.
And it's wrong to call the state of Israel a colonial apartheid state.
I would say that Israel right now, a number of different human rights organizations talk about them in that sense. Personally, I don't see Israel that way. I've been there many a times. I have family that live there. I've been to the West Bank. I've enjoyed it. However, there are considerable issues regarding the occupation that need to be addressed, and inadequacies between how Palestinians live in the West Bank versus how Palestinian Israelis live in.
My time, I'm only interrupting you because my time has almost expired, and the chairwoman is being extremely strict on the time. So, but I just want to make this point because I think we're seeing it over and over and over where you have actual campus apparatus, DEI apparatus on these campuses. These are departments, these are officials, these are professors who are weaponizing that against Jewish students. My question is, shouldn't we condemn that? No holds barred. Say that is wrong for DEI officials to be saying Israeli students are colonizers, Jewish American students are colonizers, Israel's an apartheid state. That is wrong, full stop, no conditions. Would you agree with that?
I would say that a lot of DEI programs need to actually bring into its anti-Semitism training, either going to other organizations, because so much of what is happening within the DEI
or just be eliminated. Why don't we just eliminate the DEI programs and eliminate the kind of reverse discrimination against Jews that they are promoting?
I appreciate your passion, and we understand. Thank you very much for your participation. I'll also, I caught myself a moment ago getting excited as well, but I'll remind the audience, as Chairman Grassley said, we need to conduct this hearing with decorum so that we can remain efficient. So I'd ask for your help and participation in that. And with that, I'll send it over to Senator Cruz.
Anti-Semitism is evil, it is wrong, and it is flourishing with the acquiescence and, in many cases, active participation of students, of faculty, of administrators, and government officials. And sadly, the Democrat Party has a deep and pervasive problem confronting this evil. For the last 2 years, in the wake of October 7th, this committee held 0 hearings on anti-Semitism in the United States, despite the fact that Republicans repeatedly called for it. The acts of violence prior to October 7th, 3,669 anti-Semitic incidents occurred in the United States. Following October 7th, in less than 3 months, that number spiked to over 5,000. In 2024, that number skyrocketed to 10,005 anti-Semitic incidents. This problem is particularly acute on our college campuses. Columbia University was a major epicenter where they encouraged, tolerated, and celebrated this vicious and vile anti-Semitism. Rabbi Eli Buehler emailed every Jewish student on campus and said, quote, "The events of the last few days have made it clear that Columbia University's public safety cannot guarantee Jewish students' safety in the face of extreme anti-Semitism and anarchy. I would strongly recommend you return home." This is the rabbi at the university saying your school will not protect your safety. And Columbia didn't do a damn thing about it. And I'll tell you what, the rabbi wasn't crazy. Here is one picture taken on the campus of Columbia. In the back are Jewish students waving American flags and Israeli flags. In the front is a Columbia student wearing a mask because these cowards are oh so brave they cover their faces, holding a handwritten sign that says Al-Qassam's next targets. Al-Qassam is the military branch of Hamas. Understand what this student is saying. She is calling for the murder of her Jewish classmates. And by the way, this student, the internet being what it is, she's been identified now on the internet. This is not a Palestinian who's subject to oppression. This is a rich blonde girl from Atlanta whose parents are multimillionaire real estate developers, and they got so proud, I'm sending my child to an Ivy League education where she'll be indoctrinated to dress up and advocate Hamas murdering Jewish students because they are Jews. Now, if you agree that is evil and vile, let me ask you something. Where are the Democrats? Not a one is here. And it's because the Democrat Party has decided the pro-Hamas wing of the party is more important than protecting Jewish students in America. And if you don't believe me, maybe you'll believe Chuck Schumer. No, that's the wrong one. No, it's not. Chuck Schumer, texting with Columbia, said the following. On January 4th, then President of Columbia, Shafik, explained to Shipman and her fellow co-chair David Greenwald that she had met with Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, who advised Shafik that universities' political problems about anti-Semitism are really only among Republicans. We, the Democrats, we don't care about this anti-Semitism stuff. Ms. Lewin, am I the only person that has noticed that these anti-Israel, pro-Hamas, anti-Semitic protests, that the tents all match?
No, you are not the only one to have noticed.
Is it clear that there is significant money funding these attacks on Jewish students and attacks on America?
It is clear that there is coordination and there must be some common funding.
In the last 2 years, under the Biden Justice Department, are you aware of any investigation to follow the money behind these protests?
I am not.
Are you aware of anyone who has been indicted for funding these protests?
I am not.
Are you aware of any university that has had their Title VI federal funds cut off because they've tolerated, welcomed, celebrated, and as Senator Hawley put out, had their own officials cheering on anti-Semitism, as even one university lost their funding?
I am not aware of any university having actually lost their fund.
And I'll point out also, some of the defenders say free speech, free speech. You're right. You have a free speech right as an American citizen to say vile, hateful, bigoted things. Let me ask you something. If a university student went into the public square dressed up in a Klan outfit, burned a cross, and said we should murder African-American students, do you have any doubt the university would expel that student?
I am fairly certain that the universities would take action and ensure that their policies
They should
were followed.
expel them if they're foreign students. They should be deported. And mark my words, if you are horrified at the anti-Semitism, you will see the Trump Department of Justice follow the money, prosecute the people who are paying for this, prosecute those engaged in violence, and cut off the money from universities that are tolerating and celebrating this. That is the rule of law. And ask yourself, why did the Biden Justice Department do absolutely nothing about this horror that is unfolding?
Thank you, Senator Cruz. Senator Whitehouse, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Just for the record, my count is that 8 Democrats have been here for this hearing, and didn't want to have anybody think that we were, for any reason, not interested. I want to offer a particular personal welcome to Mira Solomon. We have a friend in common who thinks extremely highly of you, and I wanted to pass that on. And I also wanted to just offer for a moment some thoughts about some things that went right. There's been a lot of focus on what went wrong, and clearly a lot went wrong. But in Rhode Island, our universities did a pretty good job. And one thing that stuck out for me as somebody who looks at the justice system and particularly the concept of restorative justice, which is I think, a useful way to think about justice. In one of our universities, the administration went in to see the protesters occupying a building and did two fairly simple things. One said, you're expelled if you're not out of here by X time, every single one of you. And that managed to clear out the building pretty quickly. I think a lot of parents who put a lot of money into tuition would not be amused. And if you weren't a student at all, you had no business in the building to begin with. The second is that they insisted on a program of restorative justice so that the students who had interfered with the upcoming graduation, the preparation of their fellow students for the upcoming graduation, for finishing senior projects or other projects in the mad rush to finish out a college year. And they went through a process of restorative justice so that people who had done that had to understand what they had done to their fellow students with these activities. That's not enough, and that's not all, but I thought it was a very useful and creative use of the principles of restorative justice, and it certainly kept the campus on a good, humane, proper footing, which I think was very, very important. So I think I'm the last. Oh, no. Senator Moody is still here. I'll close out the hearing with that. I welcome you all. I thank you for your attention to this. There's an enormous amount of work that we need to do, but I think we need to look not only at the bad examples, but also at some of the good examples as we craft ways to make sure that the college environment is protected and the dangerous head of anti-Semitism gets stomped on as soon as it appears. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Senator Whitehouse. I want to first thank our witnesses. I know anytime there is a hearing or an event or a discussion which involves so much passion and people that want to protect others, and I know that it is difficult to prepare, it is difficult to be here, it is difficult to participate without being overcome with emotion and many times, and I felt that also from our audience today. So thank you for being here and participating. We're very grateful. Our government does not function unless it is truly a reflection of we the people, and so for everyone who took time out of your lives to be here today with us and participate in your government, this is your government, thank you. This process does not work, our government does not work if it is not reflective of the people that sent us here and gave us this opportunity to serve. So thank you very much for being here today. Thank you for bearing with us as we tried to remain orderly and efficient throughout the morning so that we could conclude at a reasonable time. I appreciate that. The record will remain open for a week, so if there are any submissions that need to be made, you may do so. The senators will have an opportunity to ask additional written questions. If you do receive those, if you could please respond and turn those back in within a week, that would be great. This hearing was a long time coming. We've watched, I think, a lot of us over the last few years, and we're hoping for this opportunity. I thank Chairman Grassley for, as soon as we got the 119th Congress up and going, this is one of his first hearings. He felt it was that important. I agree with him. So many of my colleagues agree with him. So we were waiting for this day with anticipation. I know many of us were frustrated. We only had 5 minutes, but we all tried to stick to that, and we were grateful that you helped us stick to that time limit. Thank you again for being here. I want to thank all of the staff who helped make this hearing possible too. They are the fuel behind the engine that makes this committee run. So we're very grateful to the staff that's with us. And with that, we are adjourned for the afternoon. Thank you so much.